Welcome to the Australian War History Podcast. This is the second episode of the Timor series. Please visit our website australianwarhistory.com.au for show notes. We can also be found on Facebook, so it's facebook.com/AUS or Oz War History. There's also additional stories to be found there as well. There's now a group to join if you want to join in the discussion as well, which I'll link to on Facebook, so if you want to go there, you can find the link. From the Australian War History team, we hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Wayne Lamott, who will be discussing the next stages in the war. Would you like to take it away?
I certainly can. Yeah, so I think we, at the end of the first episode, we were talking about the second independent company's arrival in Timor, and they were actually, something that I don't think's been mentioned is that their insignia on their epaulets was a double red diamond, and they were called the double red diamonds. So the double red diamonds have arrived in Timor, and they were quite worried about the Portuguese because they were the colonising country and had been there for quite some time, and there hadn't been any canvassing of the Portuguese response by the Australian government beforehand. So it was doubtful, would the Portuguese welcome them with open arms or resist them, or what would happen? And so when they arrived in Dili on the troop ships, they were quite worried, and they were, a number of the soldiers said, should we put cartridges up the spout, up the breech? And the commanding officer said, let's just pause on that one until we find out what's going on. And so many of the men were walking up the kind of the streets of Dili, and there's a lot of kind of white Portuguese buildings there. It's really quite an attractive looking place, and so they're walking up with their 303s, walking from side to side, and it was silent, and but I was thinking, gee, is this a silence a precursor to
an ambush,
yes,
something like that?
Yeah. So they were still quite worried, and they were just walking. I think there were about 10 or so men walking up the roads in various formations, and eventually the Portuguese came out. I wouldn't say they welcomed with open arms, but there was no firing. no one died.
Yeah.
No one died, and so it was a kind of a very welcome situation for the Australians. So here they are in.
Well, they didn't have to fight two wars.
No, that's right. Against the Portuguese and the Japanese and the Germans. I mean,
did they know about the Japanese yet, or were they just,
no?
So they were just going there. So they were just didn't know about the Japanese. The Portuguese were the potential threat.
They were, yes,
and they were not a threat after they walked. Yeah.
Oh well, so while they were travelling to Timor, we have Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, 1941. And so they thought, well, the potential enemy is going to be Japan. And so that's who they were expecting to fight. But they thought, let's not have fighting on two fronts, Portuguese, Japanese. So it was a bit tricky there, but luckily it turned out to be okay. But it was, so they set up their kind of infrastructure in Dili, and it's quite a pleasant little town. It's right on the coast there, and it's surrounded by sheer mountain rises. As I said before, it's one of the most mountainous islands on Earth. And so they decided, well, the best idea, because we don't know much about the mountains, let's set up in Dili. And so they congregated around the airport, and they set up in some marshy coastal plain.
Is Dili like right at the very? I was looking at some maps. It's like the very northern.
It is right at the north of.
Like when you're coming down the Malaysian Peninsula, Dili's like
pretty
much there, ready to be. It's in line for an attack, I should say.
Well, it is. It is. It's It's in the north of the island,
Yeah.
and so that the harbour it's really quite suited for bringing in kind of large transport ships, and so it was well set up.
Yeah.
You know, an area there where you can bring men on from the ships and they can set up things. But as I was saying, they set up on this marshy coastal plain, and there were quite a few swamps close by. Result, a lot of mosquitoes. It's a tropical island, and so the mosquitoes thought, Australians, let's attack. So no Portuguese attacks, but mosquito attacks. Result, so many of the men were knocked over with malaria. In fact, they were quite worried that had the Japanese kind of attacked, 2 or 3 weeks after that they'd arrived there, they would have had no opposition at all. 90% of the men had come down with malaria. And so the Australian, the medical officer, Captain Dunkley, talked with Major Spence, who was the commanding officer, and said, we really need to relocate. This is the wrong spot. So they thought, well, mosquitoes don't like mountains, apparently. And so they thought, well, let's go up into the mountains outside of Dili. And so they shifted to a spot called Three Spurs, and it's south of the capital Dili. That was called Three Spurs because there were 3 spurs jutting out from a ridge. And it's funny, there's a lot of white gums. They look like eucalyptus trees, the trees we have in Australia. So it was kind of comforting to the Australians to see these white gums at Three Spurs. But as soon as they shifted there, malaria dropped away. They were using quinine, which was the method of getting rid of the malaria disease, and men started to recover. There was also... They're being fed by the local Timorese. So things were improving at that stage. They kind of were, like I said, they were setting themselves up infrastructure at this Three Spurs base. And then the next phase of the Timor campaign occurred in the middle of February. In fact, February the 19th. And we know that Darwin was attacked by Japanese bombers on February the 19th, 1942, and equally Timor was attacked. And so on the night of February the 19th, the Japanese, for 3,000 soldiers, attacked Dili. The transports just kind of anchored in the harbour there, and there were quite a few explosions, shells going off, and a lot of the Australians who weren't in the capital city, they thought it was just thunder and lightning. They really didn't think that the Japanese would have attacked so quickly, but they just thought, a bit of thunder and lightning, normal stuff, what's the problem? But we know that the Japanese had attacked, and they were moving up the roads outside of Dili. And so the first engagement with the enemy occurred on the morning of the February the 20th.
So they kind of shelled
They were shelling the capital from offshore, and then they got their troops on the land, and then it stopped, and then the Japanese were moving up the roads into the mountains, and there was a Japanese patrol which was moving up the mountains towards Three Spurs, and there was a number 7 section. Was their time for R&R. They had every day a truck would go down into Dili, and the men would have some R&R, rest and recreation, to escape from the Three Spurs little kind of area there. But
it's not, you don't get malaria, but again, you're not in the 5-star hotel.
No. It wasn't. It wasn't.
Luxury living.
It wasn't the Hyatt. but here they were a bit of an escape from the normal routine, and they'd go down there, and there'd be, the Timorese loved gambling there, and there was a lot of cockfighting, so there'd be a lot of betting on these cocks, which one was going to win. They'd have spurs coming off their feet, and they'd fight each other, and the Timorese would bet on it, and there were bazaars and kind of stalls there where they could buy food. So it was, for the Australians, it was quite pleasant, it was a bit of something different. Yeah. So number 7 section, and Doc Wheatley, who will figure later, and I think we might have mentioned him already, he did like his liquor, Doc Whitley, and he that night before they'd had a two-up game, and Doc had a few drinks, the local variety. I'm not too sure what it was, but it did induce stupidity, and he woke up and he wasn't too flash.
I suppose it doesn't matter what it is.
No, it doesn't matter.
Does it?
That doesn't. That's right. So there's Doc. He was supposed to drive the truck down, and he said, "Look, I'm too crook, alcoholic poisoning."
Yeah.
And then so another bloke decided, well, I'll drive in your place, and so Doc went back to sleep, and luckily for him, that meant he survived. But so they were going down on a truck, 14 men, and Keith Hayes was one of those men. Anyway, so this Japanese patrol was moving up the road. They obviously heard the truck, set up an ambush. They ambushed the truck, and 10 of the men were shot. Now, it's a bit kind of finding out exactly what happened is slightly difficult, but it appears one of the privates going down in the truck, a Private Peter Alexander, he wasn't dead. He was wounded in this attack, and he was taken to Dili, and I think questioned by the Japanese and eventually shot. But the other 9 men they were in the ambush. They died. There were 4 that survived, and Keith Hayes was one of the 4. They lined them up. They had a machine gun, and the machine gunner was going to spray of bullets across their chest. Now, Keith Hayes is not a tall bloke. In fact, he was about 5'3", so he's quite diminutive in stature, and when they fired across the chests of the 4 men, Keith was shot in the neck. The other 3 men were shot in the chest, and they died. So, but Keith wasn't dead. He was shot in the neck, and he feigned death. And so the Japanese soldiers walked up to the 4 men, the 4 corpses, inverted commas, corpses, and bayoneted each of them in the neck. And so Keith's been shot in the neck and bayoneted in the neck, and managed to convince somehow, great acting, he should have received the Oscar.
Yeah, like that is crazy. Like, just, how could you not? But I suppose if your life depended on it, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, I think
he said to me he stuck his kind of mouth in the mud as best he could without, to give the appearance that he was dead, but with a slight gap there where you could breathe. But, it was an Academy Award performance, and the Japanese, they took his watch, and they took the watches of the other men as well. Anything of value was taken, and they left. And then it was quite close to a Timorese village, and there was a lady there who saw the whole thing, walked over and thought, well, there's all these dead men, and all of a sudden Keith was kind of making some movements, so she thought, gee, one alive. Anyway, she took him to the village, and they applied these kind of, it was a mud poultice and natural herbs which they used as a healing kind of agent, and so he was on death's door, lingering between life and death for about 2 weeks. As you could imagine, he was very sick, and these native remedies worked, but without the assistance of this lady, he would have died without a doubt. There's no question of that. And so gradually Keith became he became a little stronger, and eventually she took him back to, it was number 6 section, and there he stayed. But the kind of epilogue to the story is that he never really recovered from it, psychologically. I mean, physically he recovered, we know that, because he only died about 2 years ago, so he was physically, it didn't have a huge impact upon him. But when there was contact made with Australia, because for 4 months there was no contact with Australia. The radios weren't working for some silly reason. They had the wrong batteries in them, and so there was no contact with Australia. When they did make contact, which is an interesting story, which we'll talk about later, via this kind of made-up radio set taken from all kinds of different parts of the truck and various other things, they made contact with Australia. And that particular radio is in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. And it's a little exhibit on the Timor experience. So as soon as there was contact made, Keith had been suffering nightmares in quite a bad way, and so he was transferred as when they could get him back to Australia, back to Darwin. The final part of that little story is that Keith he never forgot the fact that his life was saved by this lady and by the Timorese, and so as for atonement, almost like a payback. He was involved in every year sending a whole container load of bikes, stationery, anything that the Timorese needed. He kind of was the organiser, and so he would send this cargo of goodies, Christmas presents, to the Timorese, and that was his way of saying thank you. But he's a gentle soul, Keith Hayes. He's great. Just talking to the man, this wasn't an aggressive kind of part in his personality at all. He was just a gentle man that survived an amazingly traumatic experience. So
it's almost superhuman, like to have a bullet to the neck,
yes,
a knife to the neck.
Yes.
You should be dead.
You should be dead.
There's no...
Yeah. I actually, like I said, I've spoken to the man, I looked at his neck, and there are the two scars, without a doubt. So it's all confirmed there. And he wasn't a man to concoct a story. He was just like I said, a very gentle, good human being that he knew he had a debt to repay to them. So, and he did. He repaid more than kind of ample. But there was another interesting story. While they were just before the Japanese attacked, my uncle, who loved his gambling, he used to set up gambling schools in Meekatharra. Often his name would appear in the paper.
Gambling schools.
I use that word school very loosely. Now, just gambling places.
Okay. I thought it was teaching. Hey,
there's a lecturer there. We need to do this and do that. Not quite. No, he was just the facilitator. He's the ring keeper, and his name often appeared in kind of articles up in Meekatharra. William John Sheen charged with illegal gambling. So he's got a history that he just never escaped from. Yeah. But he was a very good gambler, very aggressive gambler, but very smart gambler. And what happened was that they had money, obviously, when they were in Timor, and there was a big two-up night, and Uncle Jack won a lot of money. It almost cleaned out the kind of a couple of sections. He had all of their money. He was a tails better. Anyway, so here's Uncle Jack with all this money, and at that stage there was the kind of commanders of the independent company were running short of money, and so they were in a bit of a bind because they used the money to buy food from the local Timorese, eggs and sometimes the occasional chicken, sometimes a bit of beef from a buffalo. But they did depend upon the Timorese for making a kind of a diet that was useful for the Australian soldiers, what they were kind of used to in Australia. So Major Spence, who was the CO, knew that Uncle Jack had won all this money, and he went to see Uncle Jack and he said, a word, Private Chin. And so my uncle went to the side with him and he said, a rather delicate matter, but we are slightly short of money, and we do know that you have some money. Didn't mention where it come from. That's right. We would like to borrow that money from you. And he said, at the end of the campaign, we will repay you. So he wrote out an IOU and signed it. You know, the Australian government owes Jack Sheen a certain amount of money. I'm not too sure how much it was. I suspect it was quite a bit. To be repaid in full when they arrived back in Australia. So he kept the company going with his
nefarious ways.
That's right. Exactly. Yes.
It all worked out.
It all worked out.
That's
yes.
actually great. That's really cool.
And they also during that time, I said they were kind of had no contact with Australia. They did notice when they were in this kind of advantaged position above Dili, they saw a huge naval fleet sailing east. They thought, now, is it an American fleet? They didn't really know because their binoculars were not strong enough to really see the flags or the configuration of the battleships. But it was the same fleet that was involved in Pearl Harbor, and it was sailing towards Australia. And a lot of the Australians thought, there's an invasion force. Australia is going to be invaded by the Japanese. They were quite worried. Here we are, isolated, cut off. Australia looks as though it's being invaded by this Japanese naval force. What is our future here? So it was really quite a worry. Now, I have read, I think it was a naval force that was involved in the Battle of the Coral Sea. So
it's just amazing how nowadays we've got all this technology. It doesn't matter where you are or who you are, almost. You can find out pretty much everything about anything. As long as it's like classified information that the Australian government has and all that kind of stuff. So there's some access you can't have. But back then you didn't have that. No. You had this dodgy radio that was working half the time, and then you'd try and radio home and it wouldn't always work. You'd have all these ships going past, and you just have all these unanswered questions.
A lot of question marks.
You
that's
couldn't quite figure out. And it's a safe assumption just to think that they're going to go and invade Australia. So then you're thinking about your home country. You're thinking that you're in Timor. Would you want to go back? Is it good staying here? Like, you'd have to have a lot of good leadership,
yes.
in the Timor campaign to keep people there. Because I would want to go home. That's
well,
how I feel.
In fact, when the Japanese were sending extra numbers of troops, because I mentioned there were 3,000 in the initial invasion, and then a further 4,000. Eventually, there were 15,000 Japanese on the island, and the men were quite worried. I mean, they felt as though they were being surrounded, and there was talk there for a while of commandeering some canoes, small boats that the Timorese had, and sailing to Darwin. That's how kind of desperate they were. But eventually they thought, no, we'll stay here and we'll fight. That was the attitude taken. But there was talk there that maybe there's an easier way out, and rowing to Darwin on some pretty dodgy, they would have been coastal shipping vessels and not ocean-going vessels. So it would have been fraught with danger. But they were that worried that they were considering the possibility.
Oh, thank God they stayed, for that period of time.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
So that was they eventually just thought, no, we have to stay and fight. That's our job. And there's one other little interesting character that came up during that period, up until about April 1942. There was a character called Paddy Knight, who was Irish descent. He was a huge man. It was about 197 centimetres or 6'6" in the old currency. He was a very funny bloke, and he kind of serving as a soldier was the last thing on his mind. He just wanted to have a good time. And drinking and eating and having fun and getting involved in practical jokes was his way of doing it, And in fact, I've read a couple of books about the whole campaign, obviously, and the general consensus was 2 or 3 books could have been written about him. He was such an interesting character.
Yeah.
He was slightly cross-eyed. One of his eyes was slightly cross-eyed. He worked as a ganger on the Trans line, the line going from Perth to Sydney. 120 kilos, so he was a big man, loved his food, and he was always involved in nonsense, like I said. And what happened was that there was one little incident that kind of serves to give you a bit of an idea that the man, but that when they were in a place called Barlow Creek, which was just before Catherine, when they were stationed in Catherine, they stayed there for a short while. And they were a bit short of food, and there was a fridge that was locked, and they thought, ooh, gee. Well, Paddy Knight thought, ooh, gee. Not about the others. He said, let's see if we can break in. So he managed to find some tools to break into the fridge. They got in, and there was booze, of course, and there was a turkey, and both the booze and the turkey disappeared. and you know, so they had a good time. Some of them had a good time. And then eventually it was discovered that these things were missing, and so there was a big roundup call for, you know, and there was a CEO took over responsibility of talking to the men about this serious matter, and because he wanted to find out who was responsible. And he said, I would like the men to confess. And there was complete silence. And then Paddy, who was, you know, good, pretty quick-witted, said, I can't see anyone picking their teeth, so what's the problem? So there's a lot of laughter, and, you know, and he probably shouldn't have said it, because, you know, he should have said, with respect, sir, or something like that. But that was the kind of man he was. But unfortunately, you know, he was a huge man, and you know, he was involved in the early. After about 3 or 4 weeks on Timor, he was duty with another section, and they got in kind of this firefight with a Japanese patrol. There was a Japanese machine gunner there. Now, the wisdom often is when you know, if you're fighting against a group, you often pick out the biggest man and you knock him over. And I mean, that's why, you know, the Corporal Ben Robert Smith in Afghanistan, when he won the VC, he's a huge guy. He's 6'5" or something. So, and you know, he was attacking the Taliban, and somehow he survived this ambush, and they were firing at him. And I thought, gee, you know, on a couple of accounts, number one, he would have been the target, because he was a big man, and the attitude is you knock off the big man first, and that tends to demoralise the rest of the soldiers. But he, on those two accounts, huge man, and kind of in the line of fire, he survived both and won the VC. Not so fortunate with old Paddy Knight, because they were kind of ambushed, and they lined him up, and because he's such a big man, and he was the one that was shot first, he was killed. But the worst part about it was the terrible part about it was that the Japanese skinned him as a kind of, that's their record of conquest, and they skinned him, not alive because he was dead, but they skinned him. And when the soldiers got to when the Australians got to his outpost, and there were 4 guys that were shot. There was poor Paddy Knight being skinned completely. Terrible, terrible situation. So for a lot of the soldiers, they saw these horrible sights, these terrible acts of cruelty. So for them, it was like payback time whenever they ambushed, you know, here, this is for Paddy Knight, and what you did to Paddy Knight. And there's so many little stories like that. And I know my uncle used to... often when he was down in his, we used to call it the ranch, but it was a property outside of Kalgoorlie, a lot of men from Kalgoorlie served in the second independent company. They'd kind of congregate on a Sunday afternoon at my uncle's place, and they would talk about these terrible things they'd seen, and there was a bitter kind of hostility and anger towards the Japanese. It never dissipated, you know, for many of the men who saw these things. You know, we talk about it's racist and all that, but they, you know, it's very easy to make those judgments. And unless you're there, unless you'd seen some of the things that these men had seen, and their own, not their flesh and blood, but men they're very close to, they depended upon these men for their livelihood to survive. And here they are being butchered, slaughtered in various guises, so they never really forgot it. You know, there's stories of men even refusing to buy Toyota cars because made by the Japanese.
Yeah. Which is, I don't think it's amoral, moral, or whatever it is. It is what happened at that time in our history, and I don't think we should judge them any less or any more based on going away in that situation and not necessarily liking the Japanese. I mean, I think it's an okay assumption for them to not like them and for them to think that way.
I agree. Yes.
Maybe it's not a thing that we should carry on thinking, if you know what I mean, because we've kind of moved on. But part of that generation, that was what they experienced. Yeah, and absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to forgive. There's Weary Dunlop, who has a statue outside the Australian War Memorial. One of the great the kind of heroes of World War II. He was a medical doctor on the Burma Railway, and he saved so many men's lives. You say to the Japanese, that man cannot work, and they 2 or 3 times they had him down on his knees and about to slice off his head with a samurai sword, but things intervened and he survived. But he'd stuck up for his men. He said, that man is too sick to work. He can't work, and he put his life on the line. And but at the end of the war, he wrote some diaries, Weary Dunlop diaries, and he said, despite everything we've seen, despite the terrible things we'd seen on the Burma Railway, the only way forward is to forgive. He said, otherwise you just get eaten up inside. He said, you just, it consumes you, and you don't, and it's almost like your life ends at the end of World War II and you don't forgive and move on. He said, it's the only way as the soldiers could really begin a new life, was to forgive the enemy. And he said, very hard, but the only way.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how I'd fare.
No, I think I would not. I would find it very difficult.
So, yeah. Well, is that all you'd want to talk about?
Yes.
Today?
No, so that's our little diet for today. A little morsel of food, so to speak. So next week is episode 3.
Thank you for listening to the second episode of the Timor series. If you'd like to see the show notes, please go to australianwarhistory.com.au or Facebook, which is facebook.com/AusWarHistory or AUS. The next episode will be released in 2 weeks, and I'll also be releasing sneak peeks of the third episode, so make sure you head over to Facebook to check those out. From the Australian War History team, thank you for listening.